So in the conclusion of Ruin and Renewal, Civilizing Europe After World War II, his latest book, Paul Betts writes as follows about the transformation since 1989. Notice how he uses fable. Open borders, long proclaimed by the supporters of the fabled revolutions of 1989 as the very expression of freedom and human rights, are now identified as the very causes of insecurity. And he goes on to notice, end quote, and he goes on to note that 1989 has acquired a very different status today, especially in the Eastern European far right, but we might note also to the global left and much more of Europe as well. Like communism before it, he writes, liberalism is dismissed as another gauntlet fail. Now, that brilliant and wonderfully original book focused on the seemingly paradoxical civilizing of Europe after 1945 and the obsession with civilization and European civilization in crisis since then, and especially in the last 2 decades, has everything to do with 1989, the subject of Paul's talk today. And there, 1989, or rather the 80s and 90s, played the role of a pivot or hinge toward a new rhetoric of salvaging civilization, usually from terrorism or religion, also from non-European quote-unquote barbarism. As with the word fabled revolutions just a second ago, a lot more than the usual scenario happens there. And so I understand and hope that we're in for some rethinking today of what 1989 has stood for and what it should be made to stand for. At any rate, not an easy salvaging and triumph of liberal democracy. If there was a God that failed, we'll get to see how cracked the pedestal of the idol was when it all looked at its shiniest. Paul is professor of modern European history at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. Before publishing Ruin and Reverso, that's interesting, Ruin and Renewal, sorry. He was best known as a cultural historian of the 2 Germanys, East and West. With his 2004 book, The Authority of Everyday Objects, A Cultural History of West German Industrial Design, and then his 2010 book, Within Walls, Private Life in the German Democratic Republic. All 3 books have won important awards, and Ruin and Renewal won the Jacques Bazin Prize of 2000. Now, if some of the earlier works derived their originality from having a quite precise object, we can see how many of his other interests because of the massive collaborative edited projects that he has published. These are vast in scope, from photography to religion, science and communism to heritage. He was the chair of the German History Society from 2011 to 2014, has co-edited the journal German History from 2004 to 2009, and now he runs the Darendorf program at St. Anthony's College on Europe in a Changing World, in which Remark has just begun to be involved. So with this, please join me in welcoming Paul Betts to Remark and to his talk for us today.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and also for the introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. This is, in many ways, the beginning of a new project. That's something that kind of came out of some things I've been working on and off the last few years. The first kind of foray into this project was a piece I'd done for the journal Past and Present, which was in a sense a kind of critical reflection on the 30th anniversary of 1989. In a sense, what I did, or at least what I tried to do there, is look at the 30th anniversary in comparison with the 5th, the 10th, the 20th, in terms of how different the kind of inventory of 1989 looked just a few years ago in 2019. So that got me kind of interested in terms of thinking differently about 1989 as a kind of an effort into to integrate some new research. So it's the first time I've actually presented this material, so hopefully it'll make some sense to you. I'm going to start with a story which probably some of you may remember. I'll go ahead and start with that. On the 21st of February, 1990, the dissident playwright and newly elected president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, was invited to speak before a joint session of the US Congress. Havel opened by recounting the improbable turn of events that brought him to Washington. Only a few months before, as late as October 19, he had been arrested by what he called the most conservative communist government in Europe, now arrived in the US as the new leader of a new country that sought, as he put it, to establish a prosperous market economy and its own foreign policy. So dizzying had been the pace of history, he continued, that we had no time even to be astonished, and none of the familiar political speedometers are adequate. He claimed that the Soviet Union, quote, taught us to see the world in bipolar terms, one a defender of freedom, the other a source of nightmares, and then thanked the Americans for having, quote, helped us to survive until today without a hot war this time, merely a cold one. The good news, as he put it, was that Czechoslovakia was returning to Europe, and the US had largely made this possible. And as a kind of further bouquet to his American audience, Havel added that we must all learn many things from you, from how to educate our offspring, how to elect our representatives, all the way to how to organize our economic life so that it will lead to prosperity and not to poverty. He concluded by saying that what Czechoslovakia needed above all from the US was not economic assistance, but something he described as paradoxical. Quote, you can help us most of all if you help the Soviet Union on its irreversible but immensely complicated road to democracy. Havel's hour-long speech, supposedly written quickly the afternoon before, was a great sensation, punctuated by no less than 5 standing ovations. Journalists reported that the congressman sat in rapt attention, while Czechs in the visitors' gallery were moved by his words, supposedly occasionally wiping away tears. His call for the US to assume its global moral responsibility to make the world safe for liberalism was applauded by those present and by readers of his speech. Afterwards, Havel was congratulated by his listeners and then whisked off to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine here in New York City for a reception with 5,000 well-wishers and A-list celebrities, including Paul Newman, Placido Domingo, and Kurt Vonnegut. During the event, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel effused to Havel that, quote, tonight I wish I could speak in Czech. Tonight I wish I were Czech. Tonight in your presence, we are all Czech. Biographers describe Havel's performance in Congress as the beginning of a, quote, love story between Havel and America. Now, even if some criticize the speech, Noam Chomsky called it an embarrassingly silly and morally repugnant Sunday school sermon. It was a touchstone moment that conjoined American idealism and Eastern European dissidence in a new mission of post-Cold War liberalism for liberated Eastern Europe. Havel's 1990 speech came after a year in which the wildfire revolutions that swept across Eastern Europe that momentous year were commonly celebrated as the grand victory of liberal democracy over Soviet-style communism. Tribute was paid to what dazzled participants and scholars alike reverently called the Annus Mirabilis, or the Year of Miracles. That the Central European uprisings of that year were bookended by the violent crackdown in Tiananmen Square in early June and the live televised execution of the Ceausescus in Romania on Christmas Day helped lend these velvet revolutions an improbable and even otherworldly glow. Such an account was reinforced by the view that 1989 was a tale of 2 June 4ths. First in Beijing with Tiananmen Square massacre, and the second one in Warsaw, whose parliamentary elections held that same day saw the stunning electoral breakthrough of the Polish Solidarity movement. The upheavals were often seen, especially in France, as the greatest bicentennial paean, the French Revolution being celebrated that summer. There was much talk that autumn that 1989 was a late 20th century version of the springtime 1848. Francis Fukuyama's 1992 bestseller, The End of History and the Last Man, provoked strong criticism about the ways in which he trumpeted 1989 as the world historical triumph of liberalism over its political rivals. But his prediction about the end of history has come true in one sense. 1989 continued to serve as the chronological finish line of most university courses and historical interpretations in Europe. But how quickly things changed a few years later. Havel, the world's most famous figure of post-communist transition, was already facing headwinds as the newly installed Czechoslovak president was managing his country's rising expectations, political transformations, and collapsing welfare state. The breakneck speed that he said defined the heady days of 1989 did not relent after the fall of communism, but rather accelerated even more so. Of greater concern was that the glorious year of miracles was suddenly degenerating into something unforeseen and even much darker than the bad old days of state socialism. In a frank and, I think, long forgotten piece published in the New York Review of Books in April 1992, that is 2 years after his speech in Congress, Havel drew up a sobering inventory of post-communist life across the country. Gone were the singing words about freedom and the Heideggerian philosophy about consciousness preceding being, which baffled his American listeners back in 1990. A great deal of commentary in the Washington Post about what he meant by that. Instead, this 1992 piece was much more prosaic and pessimistic. The return of freedom, he wrote, has produced an enormous and blindingly visible explosion of every imaginable human vice, one in which society has freed itself, true, but in some way it behaves worse than when it was in chains. Its catalog of ugly developments included, quote, hatred among nationalities, suspicion, racism, even signs of fascism, vicious demagoguery, intrigue and deliberate lying, as well as new and unprecedented varieties of robbery, rise of different mafias, the general lack of tolerance, understanding, taste, moderation, and reason. The end of communism had become a world turned upside down, one in which, quote, many a once feared communist is now an unscrupulous capitalist, shamelessly and unequivocally laughing in the face of the same worker whose interest he once claimed to defend. Not for nothing did Havel call his piece Paradise Lost. Such observations were common across the region in the aftermath of the revolutions, as the end of communism hardly resulted in a world of freedom and plenty for all. Quite the contrary for many. Yet this is not the image in 1989 that we are accustomed to hearing about. Recent developments in Poland and Hungary on the continent prompt us to reconsider the effects of the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe. The rise of xenophobia, resurgent populist politics of both the radical right and left, spread of illiberal democracy across Europe and elsewhere, Brexit, as well as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have predictably generated great alarm and soul-searching about the mission of Europe. Some have drawn comparisons with the 1930s, or the period just before the outbreak of the First World War for historical perspective and moral bearing. While these analogies are useful, it's the connection of these more recent events to the aftermath of 1989 that are much more decisive. Plenty of commentary on the comeback of authoritarian anti-liberalism in Central Europe has claimed that we are witnessing a dangerous repudiation, golden principles of that revolutionary autumn 3 decades after the uprisings. This is hardly new. Like all revolutions, 1989 brought in its train a mixed bag, dreams and disappointments, stark ruptures, and stubborn continuities. A telling example is the fact that the openness of frontiers and the free flow of ideas and peoples that for many came to symbolize the very meaning of 1989 have encountered stiff resistance by new regimes in Central Europe. Since 2000, we have witnessed the erection of over 1,200 kilometers of fences and new borders in Southeastern Europe, mostly in reaction to the refugee crisis started in. Bulgarian political scientist Ivan Krastev has gone so far as to say that the refugee crisis has become Europe's 9/11 in terms of the way it has violently unsettled the EU's once seemingly unstable political order and values. For many Eastern Europeans, elitist cosmopolitan values of free movement are seen as a threat, not a source of attraction or economic opportunity. Yet construing recent events in the region as simply an anti-89 backlash is misleading in my view, precisely because the unrest of 1989 carried within it the seeds of illiberalism as well. To date, surprisingly little attention has been directed to the grave issues raised in Havel's 1990 article, mainly because its legacy has largely been written to write an affirmative tale of liberalism triumphant. Comparatively less bandwidth has been afforded the gray and even darker zones of the inheritance, as some 400 million people struggled to transition from state socialism, liberal democracy, and neoliberal economics. Regional developments were and still are typically narrated according to a kind of unquestioned J-curve mysticism, based on a crude model of temporary decline, followed by dramatic ascent toward the sunny uplands of progress and prosperity. Endemic structural problems were waved off as provisional and even necessary, as economists, political scientists, and cold warriors aggressively promoted hothouse liberalism. Dangerous fallout of 1989 was either ignored or rationalized as unavoidable hiccups in the shock therapy of Westernization, arguably making the 1990s the golden age of Westsplaining. Social scientists were typically more interested in chronicling the processes of democratization than in the unsettling transformations taking place within transition countries. American conservatives cheered on the former East Bloc's return to Europe, and many Western European intellectuals shared similar sentiments. Part of the reason why Western commentators were blind to the shadow sides of these transformations was because they often linked the legacy of 1989 with the transitions from authoritarianism to liberal democracy in Southern Europe in the 1970s, as this comparative Southern Eastern European paradigm fueled the new academic fields of transitology and justice. Yet the day-to-day transformation of the region was led by the World Bank, the IMF, and later the EU, as Eastern Europe became an experimental site for the implantation of liberal capitalism east of the former Iron Curtain. In came ideas, institutions, personnel, and currency from the West, as their communist counterparts were discredited, dismantled, and discarded. In her memoir about growing up in communist Albania, Leah Ipi acidly described these Western arrivals as arrogant tourists armed with notepads and television cameras who now went by the name of the international community. The influx of Western advisors and policymakers to the region was one of the distinguishing features of the post-89 period in Central Europe and brought with it a different conception of revolution. Jan Gross observed back in 1992, revolutions used to be exported, presumably because the exporters had a blueprint for a better society to offer, or in any case, because they represented something new. This one, judging by the number of outside experts crisscrossing Eastern Europe, apparently can be imported. It is so because, unlike those of its predecessors, that is, other great revolutions, the future, the destination, the endpoint of this revolution is well known. It actually exists. It can be reached by an overnight train. This interpretation chimed with statements by Francois Furet and Jürgen Habermas that 1989 ultimately did not qualify proper revolution since it brought little in the way of new ideas and was more of a catch-up revolution based on what Furet called the familiar repertoire of the modern age. Perhaps more relevant for Eastern Europe in the longer term was the way in which regional elites opted for a model of Western imitation. And in so doing, they, consciously or not, turned their back on its noble legacy of dissent. The legacy of 1989 is a stark story of winners and losers, with millions of people badly affected. This may seem obvious enough, but part of the reason why we don't know more about the underside of revolution is because the storytellers of revolution, especially in the West, were mostly political scientists, economists, and others who sanguine interpretations of benign transition have continued to frame our historical understanding. Philip Terre's 2016 Europe since 1989 is a welcome exception, but in general, historians have contributed comparatively little to post-Cold War European history. Conversely, sociologists and anthropologists, such as Catherine Verderi, Christian Butzi, and others have offered alternative accounts of the fall of communism. And a number of vivid first-person testimonies and oral histories provide more sobering views of the aftermath of 1989. But unfortunately, these have not been well integrated into What these anthropologists in particular reveal is just how painful and difficult the transition was for many people. The post-communist period multiplied social ills across the region, including human trafficking, prostitution, corruption, criminality, substance abuse, widespread poverty, declining fertility rates, and sharp downturns in life expectancy, prompting tens of millions of Eastern Europeans to move abroad. Communist-era institutions, job security, and welfare networks crumbled. Those who gained typically were those at the top with connections and an ability to make the transition, together with the young, mobile, and well-educated. Many others were left behind. Millions of Eastern Europeans were also burned by the coming of casino capitalism in the form of get-rich-quick Ponzi schemes that exploited desperate people trying to make quick money in an unfamiliar liberal world. In Albania, the post-socialist pyramid scheme in 1996 and 1997 destroyed almost half of the country's GDP and involved around 2/3 of the entire population, causing rioting, the toppling of the government, and the country's descent into civil unrest that led to the deaths of some 2,000 people. In Russia, the so-called MMM pyramid scheme defrauded 5 to 10 million people of their money. And in Romania, the Caritas Ponzi scheme in 1993 cheated tens of thousands of citizens of their savings. Now, a few statistics provide some sense of the general chaos and slow arrival of economic progress. For starters, the per capita GDP of 5 post-communist countries in 2016, Georgia, Kosovo, Serbia, Tajikistan, and Ukraine, was still below that of 1989, 2016. In one of the most successful transition countries, the Czech Republic, its GDP declined by 14% or bottoming out in 1993, whereas in Ukraine, one of the most severely affected countries, GDP per capita declined by 60% from 1989 to 1990. In fact, the average post-socialist country did not recover 1989 levels of economic production until 2006. That is a full 17 years after the fall of communism, prompting some economists to describe post-communist recessions as the worst in modern history since 1870. There was also massive unemployment. The Czech phrase that oranges used to be scarce, now it's jobs, was a common refrain among many Eastern Europeans. In Romania, unemployment jumped from 4% to 12% in 1994 as inflation exceeded 200%. Notable too were the psychological, well, I should also say in terms of unemployment figures, it's in many ways disguise what are probably much bigger numbers in terms of the number of people that took early retirement or took on casual work. So the numbers are much, much higher than those that were reported. Notable too were the psychological effects of unemployment. According to Czech studies in 2011, fear of job loss and poverty brought 500,000 Czechs to psychiatric clinics, an increase of 43% among adults seeking counsel since 2000, spike in suicide rates across Eastern Europe. Inequality was on the rise everywhere. One marker of this inequality was the explosion of new private security firms created to protect new property relations across Eastern Europe society. Because the state was not there to protect people, citizens and businesses turned to what some scholars call violent entrepreneurs, including new mafia cultures and organized crime networks in Russia and elsewhere, many of which drew on prisoners and demobilized secret police for support. Homicide rates also spiked in many countries, and the association of privatization with corruption further discredited liberal democracy across the region. With the collapse of communism and the coming of liberal democracy and market reforms, most commentators, along with many Eastern European citizens, according to interview results, expected that corruption would drop off. In fact, it increased dramatically. Of course, corruption was rife under communism as well, as people bribed greengrocers, butchers, and those who traded in scarce goods to get desired items. But the scale and openness of corruption was something new, at least as noted in the opinion polls and views. Same went for the unexpected crime wave after 1989 across Eastern Europe, especially in the form of white-collar crime, organized crime. Russia is a well-known case, but similar developments have been documented. Explanations are generally linked to the dismantling of the welfare state, decline of trust in public institutions, society. Not all countries were alike, of course, as there were low rates in Czechoslovakia and higher rates in Bulgaria, for example. But one key commonality among all of the ex-communist countries was extremely low expectations about fair treatment from the police and state authorities. In a World Values survey conducted at the beginning of the 1990s, the transition countries, and especially Soviet successor states, ranked last among the 40 countries in terms of confidence in the police. Now, these figures are probably higher during the communist period. We don't have comparable statistics, but it is indicative of popular skepticism toward a new liberal world that prided itself on the fall. On a more personal level, poverty spiked in post-9, increasing on average by 23% in most Eastern. In the peak poverty year of 1999, 45% of all people in post-communist countries, that is 191 million people, lived below the absolute poverty line of $5. While this figure dropped to 66 million in 2010, there were still 8 countries in 2015 whose absolute poverty remained higher than a full 25 years after the fall of communism. And these are Georgia, Kurdistan, Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Croatia, and Uzbekistan. Relatedly, between 1989 and 1992, Russia, Bulgaria, and Poland saw fertility rates fall by 23%, 20%, and 5%, respectively. And in the former GDR, it fell by 47%. Such figures were directly linked to the implosion of the communist state system of kindergarten and maternity support, as many new privatized firms closed childcare facilities. Most striking, however, were the migration figures. Croatia lost 14% of its population between 1990 and 2017, whilst Bulgaria lost 20% between 1989 and 2017. UK, of course, became one of the favorite receiver countries. By 2017, 1.4 million immigrants from Central Europe and the Baltic states had settled in the UK, among them 1 million Poles, to the point that Polish is now the second most spoken language in the UK after English. Overall, the average Central and Eastern European country lost around 8% of its population between. Now, among the most affected were women, who suffered disproportionately after the fall of communism. Women were central to the uprisings in 1989, including the fight for full gender equality, but their place and position in society radically deteriorated. So strong was the trend that sociologists called it a feminization of poverty. In countries like Romania, there were some gains. Abortion was legalized in 1989, divorces were easier to get, and domestic violence legislation was passed in 2003 and 2012. But the rise in social inequality put strain on women. Between 1991 and 1994, unemployment shot up from 3 to 12% for men and from 5 to 15%. Typically, women tended to keep jobs in the public sector, such as education, healthcare, and social work, which were not so susceptible to downsizing, but they were poorly paid comparatively. Not surprisingly, women now opted for small or no families economic situation. Their political and social standing was much weaker and less visible under liberalism, and the comeback of conservative social politics, buttressed by the role of the church as moral arbiters in society in countries like Poland, often advocated traditional. Just before the dramatic June 1989 parliamentary elections in Poland, for example, which I mentioned in the beginning, the lower house of the Sejm debated legislation that would send women who underwent abortions and the doctors who performed them, should sound familiar to you, to prison for 2 years. Debates about abortion, which have erupted in contemporary Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere, had their origins in the early 1990s. Women's bodies became staging posts for the reassertion of conservative values across the region. These snapshots illustrate that instability and recession shaped Eastern Europe from the very outset of the post-war period, and in contrast to earlier predictions, did not follow the cherished J-curve model. With time, even some of the pro-liberal institutions, such as the IMF and World Bank, were forced to revise their bullish predictions to acknowledge these deep-seated problems. In 2006, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank conducted a massive public survey of all 28 post-socialist transition countries, Central Europe and Central Asia, called Life in Transition, a survey of people's experiences and attitudes based on 1,000 face-to-face interviews. It revealed a high level of popular discontent with markets and democracy, so much so that more than 50% of citizens across the region admitted that they were disappointed with post-89 developments. Fewer than 40% reported that the political situation in 2006 was better than. While younger and richer subgroups were predictably more positive, less than half said they were satisfied with their lives. In Western Europe, by contrast, only 11% reported being disappointed. Striking was that support for what was called democracy and a market economy reached just 37% in the survey. 10% even preferred a return to what the interviewers called authoritarianism and a planned economy. Only 15% said that there was less corruption in 2006 than in 1989, whereas 67% felt there was more. In 2009, the Pew Charitable Trust followed up with opinion poll surveys in 9 post-socialist countries. In Central and Eastern Europe, what was called 2 decades after the wall's fall, and 5 of the 9 countries registered declines in popular support for the transition from authoritarianism to liberal democracy between 1991 and 2009, especially toward market capitalism. More damning was the admission that when asked if most people were better off, worse off, or about the same since the days of communism, in none of the 9 countries did those surveys claim that more than 50% better off. In fact, in Hungary, 72% said that people were worse off. 62% of Bulgarians and Ukrainians. Figures for the Czech Republic and Poland were about 40%. Citizen discontent was not simply a reaction to late 19th liberalism, as assumed, but rather was rife amid the transformations and inflated expectations of 1989. This is not to say that such buyer's remorse was in any way pre-programmed. The period witnessed a dizzying variety of political hopes, claims, and possibilities. Yet rising abilities bred rising expectations. New political elites often neglected or ignored popular base. In Poland, it was widely remarked that when solidarity leaders appeared on national television to acknowledge the dramatic electoral victory on June 4th, 1989, they did not thank the electorate, reportedly to the consternation of many viewers. For many observers, these anti-communist groups were simply starting to behave like standard political parties, as original anti-political movements soon turned into political organizations in a conventional sense. And while such developments may have been inevitable to effect the transition of power, the revolutionary moment dramatically cooled as its popular base narrowed. Recall that in Poland and Hungary, less than 2/3 of those eligible to vote did so in the first free elections. Not even 50% took part in Polish local elections in May 1990. Just 2 months after the November 1989 uprising in Czechoslovakia, citizens were already complaining that key decisions were again being taken, quote, about them and without them. And in a Czech poll conducted in December 1989, the only one I know of, in other words, 1 month after the uprising, only 3% that they wanted a capitalist path of development. As most opted for a Scandinavian-style third way, that's around 50% of those asked, or reform socialism, which made up about 40%. Students in Prague greeted the first anniversary of November 17th, which is the day of the uprising in Prague, by referring to the so-called stolen revolution, after which the events of 1989 were increasingly described as a reversal of what, or a so-called revolution. The disconnection between protest leaders and the people was visible in East Germany at the time. Well, there are the pleas from older communist cultural figures, such as writers Christoph Wolff and Stefan Heim, to stay home and build true socialism. In other words, don't emigrate to West Germany, found little popular support. At that point, few were listening, as it was clear that many of the GDR's civic leaders were as out of touch as the ruling communists about the needs and desires of the people. The speedy takeover of the reunification drama by Bonn led to further dismay among East German activists, who rhetorically downgraded the hoped-for revolution of reclaimed East German independence and sovereignty, the more modest descriptor of Wende, or the feminist accounts about the disappointments of revolution for women were already being published in 1990. In the foreword to one volume, the German feminist Erika Fischer wrote, quote, "With growing disappointment, it is clear to me that the so-called revolution that has taken place was a pure male affair." Such disillusionment persisted. According to surveys at the Czech Center of Public Research in 2011, there has been declining satisfaction with involvement in public life since 1999, and the sense of helplessness of having no influence has increased from 30 to 50%. A Eurobarometer survey in 2008 confirmed the general trend. Less than a quarter of Lithuanians, Bulgarians, and Romanians, and less than half of Hungarians and Poles believe that they have been at all from the fall of communism. In part, this is because the immediate aftermath of 1989 was a double story of political de-radicalization and popular Poland is a good example. By 1989, Solidarity was not the same trade union that it was in 1980, either in terms of class militancy, social composition, or political outlook. In the famed roundtable discussions of March 1989, set in train the events of that spring and summer, Solidarity no longer made labor issues the key part of its program, aside from the right of independent trade unions to exist. Few workers served on the negotiating team. By the end of 1989, Solidarity membership was down 80% compared to 1981. Even in Gdansk, the epicenter of Solidarity, membership figures dropped from 500,000 in 1981 to a fifth of that. The dramatic drop-off had to do with Solidarity's advocacy of liberalization and the scaling back of union activities at a time when workers faced a 30% cut in real wages and renewed hyperinflation. One 41-year-old construction worker reported that Solidarity, quote, defended me in 1980 when I set up a union committee, but when I went to them for help this time, in 1990, they told me that I had to suffer for the sake of reform. What is more, in 1990, its leaders campaigned on pro-market reforms and cultural values, such as keeping abortion illegal and pledging to insert a preamble clause in the new Polish constitution, which was being written at that point, honoring God and Catholicism in an effort to strengthen Catholic moral values. Solidarity's marriage of economic liberalization and Catholic conservatism alienated many voters and former supporters, and reflected some of the broader changes across the region. The media strongly supported post-communist state campaigns to liberalize the economy and damp down popular engagement. One of the great consequences of 1989 was to conjoin democracy with its historical nemesis, liberalism, advancing a univocal ideology of post-revolutionary normality that became a kind of liberal version of Czechoslovakia's infamous normalization policies after the Prague Spring. Post-communist normalization severely curtailed policy choices and public debate as democracy and good governance became synonymous. Dissatisfaction, criticism, and the institutionalization of conflict, very stuff of democracy, was sidelined during the transition and often dismissed as unwanted holdovers from the. What this meant is that the revolutions of 1989, supposedly the apotheosis of people power and democratic mobilization, ironically paved the way for a new form of democratic deficit in the aftermath. There were other indications in 1989 it was not just a liberal revolution. First, it is worth remembering that the main focus of commentators during the heady days of 1989 was less fist-pumping triumphalism about the collapse of Central European communism than real disquiet about the unsettled status of Europe freed from its long familiar Cold War permafrost. Policymakers on both sides of the Iron Curtain had learned to love not only the bomb, but also the Berlin Wall. It's easy to forget just how common the anxieties of a Fourth Reich were. Commentators, especially Western ones. There was a huge amount of soul searching and hand-wringing about the trustworthiness of the German character given the country's bloody history. This kind of Orientalist discussion about Germany and Germans revealed the extent to which the breaching of the Berlin Wall conjured up the specter of the Second World War, drawing attention to the ways in which the Cold War had literally immobilized many of these deep concerns in Cold War. Now worries about the comeback of the Germans were ubiquitous, as fears of German revanchism and the resumed dominance of the Cold War, of the core of Europe, and possibly more, were the stuff of daily. Concern with the German legacy of 1871, 1914 was hardly limited to the West German left and became a kind of common refrain among Europeans across the Cold War divide. More reassuring voices entered the debate too, but even these were put in relation to the Second World War, perhaps best noted in Simone Weil's famous comment in 1990 that the end of divided Europe and the coming of German reunification finally meant that the guerre est finie. Whereas many commentators later interpret 1989's significance in terms of spelling the end of the Cold War, it was 1989's intimate relationship to the Second World War, for perpetrator and victim countries alike, that animated European discussion at the time. Further complicating the secular liberal script was the central role of religion in the events of 1989 in many of the John Paul II's legendary visit to Warsaw in 1979, where he turned his speech into a huge outdoor Catholic mass with outsized altar table, is the classic example. Many still view him as a prime mover behind the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe, to the extent that his tour galvanized how Eastern Europeans had traded their communist identities, loyalties, Christian ones. This is not to say that the hope for re-Christianization of ex-communist Eastern Europe came to pass. One of the durable legacies of 2 generations of communism had been secularization. And after the fall of communism, the churches, especially the Protestant ones, have had a hard time attracting parishioners, especially among. Nonetheless, the rise of conservative parties after 1989 placed the issue of Christian identity back at the center of discussion. 1989 also saw spikes in anti-Semitism. It was widely reported that Jewish cemeteries across Eastern Europe were desecrated after the fall of communism, and virulent anti-Semitism in Corneliu Vadim's Tudor's Greater Romanian Party in the late 90s, and more recently, Aryan Press's George Soros. Islamophobia was also on the rise, which had its roots in the 1980s, but which intensified in the wake of the founding of Pegida in Alternative für Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany. At one 2016 rally, German radical right protesters shouted, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people, as its mobilizing cry, the very same phrase used by anti-communist protesters in Leipzig. So the once revolutionary slogan demanding a voice in government and the end of a regime of walls and barbed wire now being used to exclude foreigners and erect new barriers on the continent. Such violence mirrored two explosive controversies that defined Western Europe's own 1989, Salman Rushdie affair and the French headscarf debate, both of which served as test cases of liberal values in France with echoes across the continent. No less striking was the development of ethno-nationalism. Amid the atmosphere of political possibility, the nation as an imagined community took on many hues, ranging from anti-Soviet patriotism to harder-edged versions of ethnic belonging. This could be seen in the reburial of deposed Imre Nagy in Hungary and the national folk songs, Latvians. In most Eastern European demonstrations in 1989, protesters flew their national flags with the communist hammer and sickle out. At times, nationalism shaded into racism. Neo-Nazis in Germany burned down asylum homes in Hoyerswerda and Rostock-Lichtenhagen, in former GDR, and also in Mölln and Solingen in West Germany to remove. The first half of the 90s also saw pogroms against Roma communities in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Czech Republic. Estonia and Latvia imposed strict language requirements for citizenship to isolate Russian minorities in their midst, who in 1989 made up no less than 1/3. Occasionally, such nationalism became violent. In May 20th, 21st, 1989, over 100 ethnic Turks were killed when Bulgarian police put down protesters against forced assimilation. And by June that summer of 1989, some 300,000 Turks were expelled or fled Zikos, Bulgaria. That Bulgaria's expulsions did not provoke any international outcry, supposedly inspired Milosevic to enter similar. The point is that today's potent concoction of nationalism, religious conservatism, racism in Central and Eastern Europe is hardly just a recent what was present in okay. Viewed more widely, the 1990s were hardly a decade of peace in Europe or the wider world. Here it is generally seen as a kind of turbocharged era of globalization and economic boom, but it also brought with it large-scale political violence. The early 90s witnessed ethnic cleansing in Rwanda, and fighting between Hindus and Muslims in India, as well as the return of genocide to Europe with the breakup of resurgence of civil strife across the globe since the 1990s marked a broader trend of the destabilization of state sovereignty as countries reacted to pressures from the international community. Anthropologist Arjun Apurdurai argues in his 2000 book, Fear of Small Numbers, that coercive liberalization produced a backlash in many countries about the meaning of national boundaries and the composition of the national community, giving rise to new and nasty claims, cultural purification of all kinds. On the one hand, states were compelled to open their markets to foreign investment. On the other, they're being bullied into respecting the human rights and dignity of cultural minorities in their midst. In this way, liberalization deepened tensions between ethnic majorities and minorities within countries over identity politics in many areas of the world. Now, at first, this may seem less relevant to regions like Eastern Europe, given the tiny number of minorities. Yet, Apurdurai argues that their small numbers make them even more threatening. For these majority groups, the presence of minorities, however limited, effectively represent the limitation and failure of the project. And their very presence has generated inequalities and an anxiety of incompleteness for the ethnically. Okay, I was going to say a little bit about the Arab Spring, but I won't. The point is then, in a sense, when we look at this particular different view of 1989, and we think also of what happened in China, Romania, and Yugoslavia. the so-called failure of the Arab Spring takes on a different perspective. So the authoritarian turn in Hungary, Poland, and Russia, to say nothing of the Balkans, makes the classic triumphalist story of 1989 in Central Europe look more and more like the outlier, not the norm, and seemingly less in the way of export value. After all, election results in Southeast Europe in the aftermath of 1989 hardly bespoke a turn toward Western style. Unlike in Central Europe, reformed or renamed communist parties won clear electoral victories in Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania. What once seemed like a shiny template for the rest of Central Europe, Middle East, and perhaps even China has proven quite limited in Africa, begun to crumble even in the very heartland of the springtime of nations. With time, Romania's brutal transition, Yugoslavia's breakup, and return to strongman politics may be the more telling tale of revolutionary, rendering the achievements in Central Europe in 1990 not just exceptional, but possibly provisional. Viewed more broadly, violent nationalism, xenophobia, barbed wire borders are just as much the legacy of 1989 as wall removal, free movement, and cosmopolitanism. Like all revolutions, 1989 still awaits its democratic fulfillment, and its legacy cuts in the. It is not and never was just liberal and gentle. It has become a site of open struggle between wildly divergent political visions for power and the reinvention of the social contract. So perhaps we have been transfixed by a false image of 1989, or at least overly preoccupied by the exceptionally velvet revolutions aspect of it. By no means to downplay 1989's remarkable influence on the so-called colored revolutions between 2003 and 2005, nor to underestimate its role in inspiring democratic movements that helped end apartheid, for example, South Africa, in the early 90s, and in stoking nonviolent democratic civil resistance further afield in Burma, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Over the course of the 1990s, such hardline liberalization measures were welcomed as the best means of overcoming Stalinist economics and the need to transform the region in the name of trade. While some policies did eventually lead to macroeconomic growth, they also accelerated social inequality, voter apathy, and popular disillusion establishment, all of which have served as the fertile breeding ground for right-wing populism. So in that way, Havel's 1990 speech and his 1992 article are both direct testaments of communist defeat. That said, the point is not to draw a straight line from 1989 to the wave of liberalism in Europe today, but rather to show that there were many 1980s. Full and contradictory inheritance still shapes European events over 3 decades later.